I'm Matt Reynolds, and this is my podcast. Veroshan and Leath, thanks for doing this.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
I wanted to, first of all, for some context, we're in your boardroom today, so thank you for, first of all, having me in.
It's a pleasure.
I wanted to start with what you guys do, for anyone who doesn't know you. How do you explain that to someone you first met? Maybe we start with you, Leath.
Well, that's always interesting, explaining our exciting lives to someone when we first meet them. So we're a commercial law firm, which means, I guess, a broad range of legal work for businesses.
Yep.
Predominantly we're, I guess you would say, are in the capital markets. So we do a lot of work with companies who are raising capital, buying other businesses or selling businesses. And quite a bit of that work is in the listed company area. So we act for a number of listed companies, and that encompasses, I guess, a lot of commercial work.
Yep.
Quite a broad range when you're a listed company.
And how did you find your way to law? Because you co-founded this firm specifically, I'm taking it 8-10 years ago.
That's
is that
right.
Yeah,
Nearly just on 10. Yeah.
Just on 10. Okay. Yeah. So how did you find your way to law? Was it something that you always wanted to do?
I think that's a very good question, and when I get asked that, I have to think back to what I actually thought when I started doing this. I think I studied it because I was interested in it, and when I studied, I actually quite enjoyed it. I found it interesting to do, and I think there's plenty of things you can study that you don't find interesting.
I found a few myself.
Yeah, that's right. And so it was really, and then it's just one thing leads to another, and one day you find yourself working in a law firm and just making the best of it. And I think as the years go by, you probably enjoy it more and more, actually, because you get exposed to more varied things and get more experience.
Yeah, and I'll continue on from that in just a second, but Veroshan, how did you originally find yourself to get to, what was your path to law?
So I studied at university, obviously, and when I was there, I wasn't entirely sure what I wanted to do, but I sort of like Leath, I kind of just fell into it, and I sort of enjoyed it while I was there, and I just it was something I was good at, so I just kept going.
And it's been a great insight. We've just been talking for you into how companies actually operate.
Yep.
What have you learned from being around? Because you guys have a pretty wide range of clients, right? From your startups right through to ASX listed companies that you work for. So there's a huge variety of business. The way businesses go about things, I suppose, that fall into that category. Mm-hmm. So is there anything that you've taken away, or what's been your most favourite lesson, I guess, you've learned in dealing with those companies?
It's a good question. I mean, I guess being at this firm, it's been good. You get a sort of a wide, as you said, you get a broad exposure to different industries and sectors and things like that. But I think it's really about people. It's the relationships that you build with those people, and in terms of looking at how management, particularly some of the listed companies that we work with, how they operate, how they manage the market, how they manage their own staff, how they set themselves objectives and go after that kind of stuff. It's been really interesting to see. So that's probably been around that kind of stuff has been, as it's developed, I've sort of learned a bit more and just try and take away what I can.
And I've come into your office today on a very interesting day, media day.
It seems to be, doesn't it?
You've got a crew from representing a New York-based company for a documentary on blockchain.
That's right. Yeah.
What is it all about?
Well, we have one of our clients in particular is heavily involved in the blockchain space and cryptocurrency space.
Yeah.
And we do a lot of work in that area, which has sort of built up over the last few years. Yep. And that client of ours is co-sponsoring a documentary that's being made here about the crypto industry in Australia.
Yep.
And so they wanted to have lawyers who are at the forefront of the space to talk about, what's the legal experience in this country, what's the regulatory environment, to explain that to others who are looking in. And I think it's also helpful. It's a cross-border industry, so there's a lot of interest in different countries looking to think about, where do I do my crypto work? Do I issue tokens in Australia, Singapore, Hong Kong, and explaining that Australia's quite a good environment for these things, quite well regulated. So they're interested to hear that.
It's It surprised me a little bit when I read on your website that you're into that, because you hear crypto and the like, you hear of unregulated,
Yes.
you know, all this sort of stuff, and then to have a law firm acting for companies that are doing business in this space suggests that there is some regulation around it. So can you give maybe a little overview of the Australian market? You said it's a good place to develop these things. For what reason?
Well, I think it's changed recently. I think initially the idea of particularly ICOs, initial coin offerings, which have become very popular, where it's effectively a method of raising capital, and it's done through issuing cryptocurrency tokens rather than issuing capital in the company.
Yep.
And that's become quite a big industry worldwide. There are hundreds of billions of dollars of tokens on issue worldwide.
Yep.
And in the early days, I guess it was almost a dirty word. It was seen to be a backyard way of raising capital. It wasn't through official channels. It was lightly regulated, and it was almost like a subterfuge. And so I can understand why people would see how are lawyers involved in this? Isn't this something you do when you don't have lawyers involved?
That's exactly the reason
and that's
for the question.
I think that's what most people would think. But,
But
it's actually becoming quite mainstream, and it's becoming, I guess, in a sense, legitimised because it's so large worldwide.
Yeah.
And so here, ASIC have spent a lot of time and have had a dedicated resource internally looking at ICOs and how does their regulatory framework interact with them.
Yeah.
And what it interacts with is the financial services legislation. So if you deal in a financial product or issue a financial product or do a lot of other things with financial products, you need to be licensed.
Yep.
And ASIC issue the licenses. And what ASIC have said, quite rightly, is a lot of these token issues are effectively financial products because they entitle you to an interest or a right, and therefore they strictly are regulated. And so a lot of people have tried to do these the backyard way, sort of off the grid or in other countries, but you can actually do them quite legitimately and appropriately in this country with a financial services license. And so there is a perfectly legitimate way to do it, and ASIC is still obviously evolving in their thinking in that.
Yes.
But the bulk of the work we do is in advising clients on the financial services regime and how it affects what they want to do, because it touches a number of points in the chain.
So is there a different set of legislation and rules specifically for cryptocurrency, or just currency, or it falls under financial services? So so what you're doing is you're applying the existing to the new technology. Have I got that right?
That's absolutely right. So there's no specific legislation to deal with it specifically. But traditionally, there have been two types of tokens, I guess, in general terms, that have been issued.
Yep.
There have been utility tokens or security, what we call security tokens. So traditionally, the concept of a utility token is like a prepayment. I get a token, it's a prepayment for a service or access to something.
Yes.
And historically, the view's been taken that a utility token is not a financial product, because it's not like a share that gives you rights in a company or right to income.
It's almost like a gift voucher.
It's like a voucher.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And so historically, the view's been taken, if you structure a token in that way, then you don't touch the financial services regime. Right. But more recently, what ASIC have been doing in refining their thinking is coming to the conclusion that a lot of those utility tokens are still financial products, because they're not as simple as just a voucher. There's more complexity to it. So that's the area that's evolved quite dramatically from what we've seen in our interactions over the last 12 months.
And I suppose from an ASIC point of view, they've got to work out where they want the country to sit in terms of being attractive, an attractive place to develop in.
Absolutely.
Because if they're really heavy-handed in the way that they regulate things, then that's going to attract less people. Whereas if you don't so much, you'll get more. So you've got to work out where you want to sit. And overall, you're saying we sit in a good place, which means we're not too over-regulated. I mean, this is a very simple way of looking at it, but is that right in assuming that?
I think so. I mean, in one sense, there are other jurisdictions around the world where you can issue tokens and be largely unregulated. So companies might be attracted to that it's easy to go to market, easy to tokenise. You don't have to spend a lot of money or invest a lot of time.
Yep.
But I'm seeing a lot of companies that are saying, well, I want credibility with what I'm doing. It's a big market out there. So doing it in a country like Australia, now there's not a lot of people who understand how it interacts with the financial services regime, but once you get some advice on it and start to understand it, in a sense it legitimises the activity you're undertaking.
Yes.
And so particularly if you're a listed company, if you're an ASX listed company and you want to undertake a token issue, then doing it here in accordance with the financial services regime, then it's legitimate, it's consumer friendly, it's protecting consumers, and that's actually a positive. So it may be more work, it may be more cost, but it's going to be more robust and seen as more robust in the market.
And are you working with clients who are trying to adapt crypto to their existing business, or they're actually starting new coins, or is it indeed both?
It's a broad range. So we're dealing with people who are operating crypto exchanges or wanting to set up exchanges. We're dealing with people who are using blockchain technology in their business. So it's not necessarily currency, it's just the blockchain underlying technology.
Yep.
And so we have clients who are experts in taking blockchain technology into businesses and adapting them to what they do in their business.
Yep.
And then we have clients who are interested in using it and come to us and say, well, how do we go about using it and how do we get commercial arrangements in place?
Yep.
And then, of course, there is the token side of thing, the actual cryptocurrency token aspect, which is a capital raising concept.
Okay.
And so then that's another end of the spectrum.
So on blockchain, can you explain for someone who doesn't understand what it is, indeed what it is? Because it's very confusing, right?
There are many people around the world who have tried to do that in a simple way.
Yes.
And if you get on the internet, you'll see many descriptions that start off simple and end up very complicated.
I have tried to figure it out myself. I've got a rough idea, but
Well, look, I think,
what do you understand?
Well, the key to the concept of blockchain at its heart is it's a decentralised mechanism, so that it's an encoded way of actually verifying transactions and verifying events. But it's done because it's done in a decentralised way. You're not relying on one body or one person to verify or to check a transaction or an event. It's actually being done by the network. And so at its heart, that's the key to the concept of blockchain. So it actually gives you a record of transactions and events, but it's seen and should be far more reliable than being issued by one person, because it's relying on a broad number of participants in the network to verify. And so that's, yes, it's decentralised, but the concept is that it's far more reliable and robust because of that.
Okay. So in a cloud environment, you have, say, a file is put into the cloud and then it's replicated in a couple of different places. And if you access that file from a Dropbox or something like that, that file itself doesn't talk to the other files at all. It's just replicated in different places. Is that right?
Correct.
Whereas blockchain, and I'm taking a risk here trying to explain this back to you, whereas blockchain is when that file is in many different places, but they're all connected. So if something happens to one of the files, it talks to the whole network and lets them know if there's a problem, right? So there's only one point of access to blockchain as opposed to the cloud where you can come at from all different directions.
I think that's a good way of putting it.
Is that right?
And it's difficult to encapsulate in concepts such as files, etc. But it is that decentralised concept and it's all about verification, and that it's being done in a decentralised way by multiple points, rather than being issued by a central point, which is where it becomes relevant in terms of currency, because of course the concept is that it's not backed or honoured by one body or one country as traditional fiat currency is. It is effectively honoured by the network and verified by the network.
So what do you say to people who have a negative view on crypto and it's scam, it won't be around for too long, and that sort of, I'm sure you know that way of thinking about these things. What's your opinion working in this space of where it's going? Is it a fad? Is it here to stay? Where are we headed?
I think the people I deal with who know a lot more about it than I do would all say, and I think they're right, that it's not going to disappear.
Yep.
We started working in this space nearly 4 years ago.
Oh wow!
And at that stage, it was Bitcoin was the rage. That was the key embodiment of it. And at that stage, everyone was saying this is going to go nowhere. It's silly. It's nonsense. And the people we dealt with said, no, this is serious. This is going to build and grow and become bigger.
Yep.
And we had no idea either way. We were interested to see what happened.
Yes.
But over those years, yes, there's been bumps in the road, but it's been going in one direction. It's getting bigger. It's becoming more. The currencies are generally more valuable than them, but also the token issuing and the number of currencies has grown and grown and grown.
Yeah.
So I think it's not going to disappear. Most of the people I talk to say probably what will happen is it'll consolidate a bit, so that yes, there are lots of different embodiments of it out there, and that they may start to distill down, and with that maybe some will become more mainstream and more reliable and acceptable, and the outliers might fall away. But most people are saying no, it's not going to disappear.
So it's a little bit like the web in the early 2000s. Everyone rushed in, a few people survived, and then we sort of had another go at it a decade later, and it's more legitimate industry. Is that what I think so? A better way of saying it? Once we get better at using and understanding these technologies, rather than just trade off the potential, which you
That's
throw
right.
any number you like at.
That's right.
Moving away from blockchain for a little bit, only because we're in an area that's well out of my range of expertise. I'm particularly, not that I have any more knowledge in it, but I'm particularly interested in mergers and acquisitions of companies that you guys deal a lot with. Maybe I can ask you, Veroshan, why do companies use mergers and acquisitions to grow? What's the strategy? What's the thinking that sits behind it?
I think there's a number of different reasons. It really comes down to sort of the strategy that the company's adopted. I think sometimes you'll see it because companies organically, their growth is limited.
Yeah.
So if they can't grow organically, a good way to add sort of headline revenue or to add more earnings to what they're already doing is just to go out and buy a competitor, or to buy someone else who is also in the same space. And that might sort of embody itself as like what's called a horizontal acquisition, where you're buying basically someone that's also offering the same service or the same product.
So a competitor.
A competitor, yeah.
Yeah.
Other times it might be because you might want to, add complementary offering. Occasionally you'll see vertical integration, which is effectively where you might say, look, we've got a supplier, we don't have a great relationship, or we're getting sort of shafted a little bit. Let's just buy out someone that's also in that sort of supplying a product or raw materials or whatever else.
Yeah.
Makes it a bit more efficient as an operation. So there are different reasons for undertaking sort of M&A activity, but largely speaking, I think probably the most common is for growth. You'll see it a lot because companies want to grow, and they see if they see that they're organically that their opportunities are limited to grow, then they might sort of undertake mergers and acquisitions as a way to sort of achieve that objective.
So when do you guys first get involved in this process? And I was hoping to sort of talk through how it typically plays out, again in simple terms if possible, so I can understand it. But if I'm looking to buy another company, is that the point that I come and talk to you guys, or where do you sit? Where do you get involved?
It's interesting. There's a lot of varied ways that it's done.
Okay.
I mean, most lawyers, probably like most professionals, would say, doctors or anyone, come and see us as early as possible.
Yep.
To get the best result.
Yes.
It is true generally. Some clients get us involved very early on. They say, I'm looking to buy something, like to talk it through with you, like to discuss what I'm thinking. And as a lawyer in this area, you get used to seeing techniques that purchasers of business and sellers of businesses undertake,
Yep.
how they assess them, how they see risk, how they identify upside. So you're around that all the time.
Yep.
So you do get a sense of it without being a corporate advisor, but you do have a sense. So what we would normally say is early on is great because we can help shape thinking and identify things to avoid early on, and that can be a pretty brief discussion.
Yeah.
So in a number of cases, that's right, that's what happens. In a number of cases, we get it way down the track.
Yeah.
When a client has cut the commercial deal, agreed a number of the fundamentals of the transaction, reduced them to rough writing even, and you're brought in with the first draft of a sale agreement and asked to look at it.
Yeah.
At which point it's very hard to undo the damage if there's already damage done.
Yes.
So it's a broad range.
And where do you see the most errors made?
Oh, that's a good question. I think one of them is if you're buying a business, probably agreeing really key commercial terms and being very robust about them very early on. And then it's hard to change if you undertake a due diligence process and you find problems.
Yep.
I think the other...
What sort of items, sorry to cut you off, but
Yeah, sure.
What sort of items are, like in broad terms, are on that list?
I would say how you structure your purchase price, for example.
Okay.
Some people say, well, I'll offer you X dollars, that's the price, I'll pay you on completion, and that's a done deal.
Yep.
Others will want to structure it where there's an earn-out, for example, so that over the next year or 2 or 3, the vendor is rewarded based on the performance of the business.
Yep.
So those fundamental structuring questions,
Yep.
in a number of instances, people will just go into a transaction thinking there's one way to do it,
Yep.
and then not realising that there were different ways to protect their risk. But once you've gone down the path and once you've set an expectation in a vendor, it's very difficult to turn that around without
Sure.
being seen to be renegotiating the whole deal.
Yep.
And things come up in a due diligence process. The idea of a due diligence is to have a proper look at what you're buying and properly assess the risk of it. You can't always do that when you're having your initial discussion. So purchasers need to be very careful that whilst they can discuss how they want to structure in the key commercial terms, that they do have an opportunity to really think about it through a due diligence process and not be stuck with where they started.
So apart from getting that initial paperwork wrong, if you like, is there anything that you see commonly that people misunderstand with the process? Because things like houses and shares are very easy to value. Like, I mean, shares, you just look online what they're worth, right? And housing, you can be pretty much right within a few $1,000s or whatever most of the time. But the way you value a business, well, first of all, there's many different ways to value a business. But so that just by nature means there's a lot that can go wrong. There's a lot that can be missed. So where do people most commonly misunderstand things?
Well, I don't know whether Veroshan would share this from his experience, but I think there are probably 2 key things that I see.
Yep.
One is when you buy, for example, a company, and it's a private company. I'm not talking about buying a listed company, which is probably different, but
Yep.
buying a private company, one of the things you always need to think about is what level of working capital is in that company when I acquire it. So it's all very well to look at the historical performance or projected future performance of the company, but when I actually take it over, what condition is it in at that point in time? And the working capital cycle of a company can vary over time. For example, cash can be high, cash can be low, debt can be high, debt can be low.
Yes.
And a lot of people strike a price but don't think at the outset about what's the actual level of working capital I'm expecting to see when I take over that company.
Yep.
And that's often a conversation that doesn't happen until later down the track. And that's a conversation that really should happen at the outset. Some indicative view of what kind of working capital I'm expecting, because that can be quite a big swing in terms of the value of a company.
Yeah, and it's time specific, as you said. So
Yeah, so I think that's one that I see quite commonly.
Yeah.
The other I see commonly is, I guess, not really thinking about some of the key aspects of the transaction, such as limitations on liability. That can often be a key issue that comes about.
Yeah.
Restraints of trade, for example. Is the vendor of the business, particularly small businesses, going to stay involved in the business?
Yeah.
And if they're not, you need to make sure they don't start another business up around the
so
corner.
that's when non-compete things come in and all that.
And non-compete's often seen as a negative,
Yeah.
that vendors don't like the concept of being restrained, but it's entirely appropriate because many small businesses in particular are really a product of a person, an
Yes.
individual, and they have an ability to start another business around the corner the next day and take a lot of your customers. So I think that's something a lot of people don't think about carefully enough, or don't have the conversation early enough in the process.
And why do you see people typically want to sell? Because if you've got a really good business, why sell it? And if you've got a business not going so well, who'd want to buy it? So how do those two parties come together?
Well, I think that there's 2 types of life cycle in people selling businesses. There's probably more than 2, but 2 in particular. One is I've been running my business for quite some time. I need an exit at some stage.
Yep.
And what's my exit? It's children or family, or it's selling.
Yep.
And they're often the two key ways of doing it.
Yep.
So what we find is that in that sort of life cycle, maybe you might be in your 50s, 60s or 70s.
Yes. So you're talking as the business owner.
That's as a business owner. So that's one type of life cycle of transaction. And then the other, so that's where the exit is probably a little easier sometimes in that environment, because the vendor is not looking to, they're not sitting there saying, gee, I could have run this business for another 10 years and earned this much money.
Yes.
You better pay me a lot for it.
Yeah.
In that situation, the vendors are often saying, I don't want to work for 10 more years, so I'm not mentally thinking I'm going to earn all that money.
Yep.
I'm happy to earn a multiple that might be more like a 4 or 5 times or 3 times multiple,
Yep.
because I don't have to work for the
Yes.
3 or 4 or 5 times.
Yep.
I get it up front, and that's a good deal for me.
Yep.
Slightly different if you're in an earlier stage, if the age or the life cycle of the vendor is earlier in time.
Yep.
That's where it can be more challenging, because they'll be saying, well, I could keep running this business for 10 years or 20 years.
Yep.
I'm being deprived of all those future earnings, so the price has got to be a lot higher.
Yep.
And those conversations can often be a lot more difficult. And the expectations between the purchaser and the vendor can be harder to bridge in that situation.
And what percentage of these possible transactions do you look at that then actually go through? Like, is it half? Is it a very small percentage? Like,
I would say probably from the stage of us getting involved, we would probably see more than 50% success. Yes.
okay.
And that's probably because most of the time we're not involved at just the idea stage. There's been negotiation, there's been discussion, and there's been a general agreement on key commercial terms. So it's got to that point.
Yes.
Where it's there's a good chance of us succeeding.
So conceptually, it's a benefit for whatever reason to both parties to actually
Yes.
make it happen.
That's right.
So I'm assuming that the more challenging scenario is when it's a younger business owner.
Yes.
And again, this puzzles me sometimes. Like, why do they want to get out? Again, like, because if they have a growing, successful business and they could have all these future earnings, why don't they just earn them? Stay there.
There's a number of reasons. One might be they're a bit risk averse, in the sense that they are concerned about the future. What's going to happen in the future with my business? If I'm paid out, then I don't have to stress about that.
Yep.
The other may be they see other opportunities, so they want to take their funds and invest them in something else.
Yep.
Sometimes a different industry, sometimes a different sector. They just opportunistic, and they see a better use for their money.
Yeah.
And the other is, particularly we see this when we're acting for listed companies, that there's a lot of appeal, particularly if you're buying family businesses or smaller businesses, that part of the payment can be in shares in the listed company. And if the listed company is on a journey and it's growing and its value's increasing, then the vendor may say, well, I'll get paid for the value of my company, but I can then participate in a greater upside in a bigger business that I believe in its future.
Yes.
And so that can be quite a compelling story for some people.
It's actually, we were just talking before we got started that about Berkshire Hathaway and Warren Buffett and all this great stuff that he's done over the years. And the year before last, I went to the AGM and he talked about value in companies and buying companies and why people want to sell. And what you've just said speaks exactly to what he was saying, that he gets a lot of business owners who have, in some circumstances, huge businesses that have made all the money, have all the fun, they're doing what they want to do every day. But he said, I get the phone call and it's always a different version of the same problem. When I drive to work each day, I've only got one worry in my life, and that's if I go, what happens to my family? They're going to be in a lot of ways burdened with this huge company and not know what to do with it. So the way that they acquire, as I understand it, quite a few companies, is by actually giving that business owner shares in Berkshire Hathaway. They can keep doing what they're doing every day, enjoy what they're doing, but then the family's protected moving forward because they basically just have shares in what is an index fund, really, the way that it's run. So it's a very risk-free way of doing it, particularly if you don't have somebody in your family interested or capable or whatever to come in and run that business. Are there any industries that you see these sales, mergers, acquisitions work better in?
Well, that's a good question. I think, I guess it will generally work better where the vendor of the business is not so integral to its success. and by that I mean often a business has key people in it.
Yes.
But I think when you've got a business that can run itself to some extent,
Yep.
and not be so dependent on those key people, because often when you're a company and you buy another business and you bring it into your management structure and your systems, that can sometimes cause issues if the vendor goes, or if the vendor comes in and isn't used to being in a team.
Yep.
So I think industries where you don't have that huge degree of key person risk, so by that I would say professional services firms can be more challenging, because often professional services firms in whatever industry, doesn't necessarily be law, but it can be IT or any other services, often there's that key person aspect which can be a bit more challenging.
And the business is built off the back of personal relationships.
I think so. And I think the best deals are often where there's economies of scale. So for example, the acquirer in acquiring the business can improve its performance through economies of scale. So your manufacturing or distribution type businesses where economies of scale are a benefit, they're industries where they can work very well, where 2 and 2 can make 5.
Right. So you see a lot of businesses. Where do you, again, it sounds like I'm coming from maybe a negative standpoint there, but where, only because I'm trying to avoid them myself, in running businesses, where do you see that's the most overlooked area? Because when you're talking about these sales and that you're sort of you're doing a fair bit of due diligence on a business,
Yep.
where are you seeing the biggest holes?
It's a good question. I mean, it sort of differs from business to business. I think sometimes what you'll see is there's some businesses out there where management are just naturally quite entrepreneurial, and they'll be out there doing a lot of deals, but that's not necessarily followed up with the governance and the oversight that comes with that. So you might occasionally see businesses where the reporting lines aren't particularly clear. Another one is some businesses don't have clear segments. So although they're doing different things or offering different products, there's no visibility of how one is performing in isolation of the other.
Yeah.
I think that is probably an area where, and that's really just in terms of just a bit of corporate governance and the way that the business is structured, and it can be easily solved, but it's just from time to time you see that.
And it'd be particularly common, I would assume, when businesses are growing really fast, right?
Yeah,
Sometimes
absolutely.
that can't keep up with
That's right.
the growth. Have you got obviously one that you can talk about, have you got a favourite story of a company you've taken through the process and then they've really gone on to flourish, that we can maybe talk through?
Yeah, there's been a few. I think one in particular that I've been involved in for some time is AMA Group.
Yes.
And it's it started when I was first involved about 8 or 9 years ago. It was a small listed company that had attempted to roll up sort of automotive industry businesses and had failed, and I got involved with a group of shareholders who were trying to, I guess, steady the ship.
Yep.
And it was a business that had, I guess, a $50 million turnover at the time, and probably 7 or 8 businesses in it. And it's basically gone about growing organically, but also acquiring businesses.
Yep.
And it's probably acquired 40 businesses over the last 7 or 8 years.
So it's a clear strategy for growth for them too.
It is, and it's very interesting because in this country there can be a bit of a negative impression of what we call roll-up companies, so a listed company that goes about acquiring in a certain segment.
Yep.
Because there's been plenty of failures, and there's often failures because roll-up's just done for roll-up's sake. Just buy things and keep buying revenue and worry about the cost later.
Yep.
But this is a company that's been very strategically driven, and it's been acquiring businesses, again, as I mentioned earlier, with economies of scale.
Yep.
So it buys a business that's performing well, doesn't overpay, pays fairly, but doesn't overpay. And then when it rolls it into its systems, processes, costs, they get more out of it than it was getting out of itself before they acquired it. So they're strategic, they're careful about what they buy, and when they buy, they get more than it was delivering beforehand. So that's a great example of buying carefully and buying strategically.
So they, in their view, they've got better systems and processes than the businesses that they're looking at, so they know they'll get that.
That's right. But they're also not arrogant. And one of the other things I notice about the successful acquirers of businesses is to actually watch what these other people are doing in their businesses and respect them and learn from them.
Yeah.
Because if you're buying a business that's making money and is profitable, it's doing something right.
Yes.
And it's rare that it's doing it by accident.
Yep.
And so what I see them do is, yes, they have probably superior systems and processes and costs, etc. But they always look at the business they're buying and see what can we learn from it.
Yep.
And in a number of instances they do, and they take that knowledge and they build their own business around it.
Yep.
So that lack of arrogance is very important, I think.
Okay. And what's sort of a area that big egos tend to operate in from time to time? Would that be a fair statement?
Absolutely, yeah. I think the person with the checkbook can often, take the view that they've got the big checkbook and that you've got a small business and therefore you're better at what you do by definition. And there's plenty of examples of that.
Yeah, sure. Have you do you have any interesting payment day stories? And the reason that I'm asking this is because I've had a couple of Richard listers on the podcast, and there always seems to be a fairly interesting day or set of circumstances around the actual getting the check and making cut-off times and all that sort of stuff. Do you have any? Have you seen anything interesting in that space, in that area? Because for some of these smaller businesses, it can be a really big day, right?
Oh, look, and the most common thing we see is that the person who's selling their business has security over their business granted to someone, and it comes to settlement day and they just haven't released the security.
Yeah.
And because it just hasn't been top of mind.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things that you can't get around. It's binary. It's not like you can find a solution. If someone else has security over your assets or over your shares that you're selling, you can't give title.
You can't give it away. Yeah.
It's like turning up to sell your house to someone and the bank doesn't come along and release the mortgage.
Yeah.
Then you're stuck. So unfortunately, we see that quite a bit.
Okay.
Particularly with small businesses, where there's so much going on, there's so much operational change that they've got to deal with to hand over the keys, that those things slip between the gaps. And you never want to be the person that gives the bad news, that says, I'm sorry, we just can't do this. But it does happen.
So you see a lot of transactions get stalled for that reason?
It does happen, yeah, it does happen, yeah.
Now, the other areas that you operate in, all things business, is that a broad? Is that a very broad term?
I think that's a fair way to put it. That's the way I usually explain it to people. I mean, there's areas that are highly specialised that we don't necessarily deal in, but most businesses have general needs that fit within the description of what we do.
Yep.
90% of probably the legal work that businesses need fits within a fairly defined framework.
Yeah. Actually, one thing I did want to ask you is that if you are considering selling or building your company to indeed sell, is there any tips, advice, the one or two things that you need to make sure you do? Yeah, obviously, you need to be able to release your own shareholding. Yeah. But apart from that, in the build up to maybe that point,
I think a lot of it is around contracts. So we do a lot of work with startups, and we help businesses grow from the start and hopefully to become big listed companies.
Yes.
But what we often see is in the early days when maybe money's tight and they're being entrepreneurial, they might get an important contract with a supplier or an important contract with a customer.
Yep.
And that may be ultimately the foundation of a lot of revenue for that company into the future. And in the early days, you might not want to spend a lot of money on lawyers getting the contract right, or you might feel like you can't drive a hard bargain because you need the revenue, you need the contract.
Yeah.
But they really can come back to bite you, because ultimately, as I say to my clients, it's not what you think or what I think. If you are going to sell this business or list this business, then someone else is going to be looking at all these things. And it doesn't matter if you think it's a good idea or I can justify it,
Yep.
there'll be another lawyer, another accountant, another corporate advisor who you don't know who will look at everything you've done
Yep.
and form a view about whether you've done it well.
Yes.
And then they'll report to their client and say it's been done well or it's been done badly. And that will ultimately affect whether the deal happens or the price at which the deal happens.
Yes.
So that's the one key message I always give my clients is, even if it's, it's early days, sometimes it's difficult, be careful with your contracting because your contracts are critically important.
I suppose it's hard once if you're building a business that does get on the table to be sold, probably that relationship could go on for quite a few years, right? So I'm guessing it's hard to go back after 8, 9, 10 years and try and put a contract around those things, because why would you if it's been working so well?
And also, when you're looking to sell your business, for example, you might need to go to one of your key customers and say, I'm selling my business, the purchaser says they're going to buy it, but they want these clauses to change in our contract.
So even if you have a contract arrangement, yeah, right. Okay.
And that can be a horrible place to be, because you have no leverage at that point in time.
Okay.
Because why, in theory, would your customer give you a change in a contract that they don't have to give you, that hasn't been there for 6, 7 or 8 years? So that can be a difficult conversation.
How do you navigate that problem?
Well, most of the time, I've seen that happen, and I've seen it happen successfully, usually because of a good relationship with your customer or with whoever the counterparty to the contract is.
Yep.
And that's a lesson that, all successful business people would employ, and that is have good relationships with people.
Of course,
and treat people well, and don't take advantage of people.
Yep.
Because you never know when you might need a favour. And
Yes.
so those things, I've seen those things successfully resolved because the company has a good relationship with the counterparty.
Yep.
And that's great. But you don't necessarily always want to have to rely on that.
Yeah, sure. Is it, and the biggest reason that stalls these processes, that stops the process going through, because this can be a drawn out thing. There's a lot of moving parts. Is there a common area that, whether it be price or whatever, that is just a real sticking point for getting these transactions across the line?
I think price ultimately is the the biggest sticking point. I think there can be other issues, obviously, that can come up, but at the end of the day, that's the number one topic on everyone's list.
Yeah. And how does every industry is different how you value it, right? So I guess that's very much dependent on what you're doing and what you're dealing with.
Indeed, yeah. I think you see very different, multiples being paid in different industries. So when that's the same valuation methodology, but it's a different answer to the valuation question.
Yep.
And different industries have different pressure points on
That's
price.
right. Yeah. And Veroshan, what does a typical day look like for you? Because,
is there a typical day?
Is there a typical day? First of all, I'm a big fan of the TV show Suits. And I'm wondering how close that is to the actual reality of being a corporate lawyer.
Look, it's not entirely dissimilar, but it's not entirely similar as well. It's, as Lee said, there's no typical day. Sort of, you get some days you get in and there's just a mountain of work to get through. And I think with our industry as well, particularly M&A kind of work, it's a bit cyclical. Yep. So you might have a period of 3 to 4 weeks where you're really just your head's in a bunch of documents and you've got a whole bunch of due diligence to get through, and things can be quite time sensitive naturally. And then once that deal finishes, there's generally a sort of a period where you're able to catch your breath, and then another deal lands on your table and you go again. So it sort of differs from time to time, and obviously there are times in the year, the sort of end of financial year is one which tends to be quite busy, but it's just sort of it's an up and down, and
there's always a rush, I'm tipping, to get deals over the line by the end of the financial year. So it's a busy time.
It is, and it not necessarily have to be a lot of deals, but there is inevitably one or two that are financial year sensitive, and as soon as something has an imperative stop date, that can create an enormous amount of work.
Yeah. Do you get involved in the actual negotiation process? Do you see yourself as advisors in that process as well?
We do a lot, And some clients don't want their legal team involved in that process. They're comfortable that they can do it themselves, and which is fine.
Yeah.
I probably tend to get involved more often than not.
Yeah.
And I think over the years, being involved in a number of transactions, I think you learn a bit about people and how to get good outcomes in negotiations.
Yep.
And that doesn't mean getting something out of the other side of the transaction that you shouldn't get. It actually means cutting through things and getting to common ground as quickly as possible and as efficiently as possible.
Yep.
Understanding what the other side of a transaction is going to be worried about and concerned about, what will push their buttons. And over the years, you learn that. I mean, you act for vendors and act for purchasers. So you understand the sensitivities, which means that makes it a bit easier, I think, to negotiate and get to a landing on key issues.
Yep.
As soon as you can have some empathy and understand the position that the other person is in, you can cater to that in a way without, giving things up. At least you can cater to it in a way that is sensible and reasonable and start at a sensible point.
Yep.
That becomes far more efficient rather than thinking only about your own position and taking ambit positions on a number of points.
Yep.
It becomes long and drawn out, frustrated, and no one's happy. So I think most commercial lawyers who have had experience on both sides of transactions can actually help with negotiations if the intent is right.
Okay. And where's you co-founded this firm?
Yes.
Where do you see the next 5 to 10 years of the firm going?
Well, hopefully more in a progression of where we've been so far, and that is doing interesting, good quality work,
Yep.
which seems to come our way. I think if you do a good job and you work with good people, that inevitably happens. And I think also it's about the people in your business as well. So, my strategy for this business is to grow and develop more junior lawyers and see them become senior lawyers, because the more senior and experienced people you've got in your team, the better the business. It's the same with any business. So,
Yeah, sure.
that's my clear strategy, is to obviously do good work and build great relationships with clients, but at the same time build the team within.
And your sweet spot is sort of the medium-sized business through to small AXS listed companies. ASX, goodness.
I think
should have practiced my words before I came here today.
It's a tongue twister. Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think that in that range, and most lawyers or commercial lawyers, won't work in one area to the exclusion of others. I mean, the issues we deal with in small purchases of business are very similar to the issues we deal with in large purchases of businesses.
Yep.
So, but inevitably, I guess it becomes a cost issue as well, and we all are positioned in the market. There are mega law firms that will do mega deals.
Yes.
And law firms of our size tend to be in the sort of small medium end of the spectrum. So listed companies up to $400-500 million listed companies we work with, and down to small family owned businesses as well.
And the current landscape, businesses actively looking in that space to acquire new things.
Yes.
At the moment, is there a high level of activity at the moment? I get the sense that there is, but
I think so. I think, and things are geographic as well. I think, and I think Melbourne in particular is a pretty dynamic place at the moment. And I think
passed through 5 million people.
That's
yesterday,
right.
Was it?
Yeah.
Or the day before, yeah.
And who would have? And I think that was 10 or 15 years ahead of early predictions. So
yeah.
So it's a dynamic place to do business in Melbourne, I think.
Yeah.
And I think over the last 10 years, I think it's come a long way. So we see a lot of activity. I think most lawyers would say the same thing, that there's a lot of corporate activity, be it mergers and acquisitions or other corporate activity. It's quite dynamic at the moment.
And someone looking at this type of career, any advice, suggestions?
Maybe Veroshan should answer that.
Yeah, I think as a lawyer, I think a couple of things that help is, legal skills are one thing, and I think you'll find in today's day and age that there are a lot of competent lawyers. There are some lawyers who probably aren't up to scratch, but for the most part, most lawyers are pretty capable. But I think it's what I found in this type of law, where you're dealing with companies and and businesses is just having an interest in what they're doing. I think there's a lot to learn from being a lawyer about business as well, and I think if you can take an interest in what your clients are doing and sort of understand what they're doing and why they're doing it, that helps to, when you're advising them, it helps you to sort of get a clearer picture of what their objectives are and how to get the right outcomes.
So it's making the words written in books.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, being able to
applying those.
Exactly. Yeah, being able to articulate things in a way that your clients can understand it and grasp it and apply it, I think is the key.
Yeah, and I think I always say to my lawyers that the best way to approach your job is not to think about what you can teach and tell other people, but actually think about what you can learn. Like if you walk into the office each day and think about it being a learning experience, you can actually learn a lot and learn about the law, but you can also learn an awesome amount about businesses and people and how they operate businesses. As Veroshan said before, that's something that you can learn every day. So that's a pretty exciting thing if you've got the right attitude.
Yeah, and I think I've tried to apply that myself in my own things that I've done. That why waste that opportunity?
That's right.
Exactly right.
It's such a good thing to get inside businesses and well, in you guys' case, be paid to be there, right?
That's right. That's right. Well, it's on the job training. And you're paid to do it. So that's right.
So just a couple of last questions before we wrap up. I always ask a couple of things. First of all, if you are readers, book recommendations.
Most of my reading tends to be reading children's books to my children, or reading contracts. So I'm the worst person to ask that question of.
I've read a few recently. Probably one of my favourite books at the moment is a book called Valuable, which is by a guy called Roger Montgomery, who's a fund manager, I think out of Sydney, and it's he employs Warren Buffett's philosophy of value investing. So it goes into how there's a real distinction between price and value. Price being what someone's willing to pay you for something, and value being what that asset or that underlying business is intrinsically worth. And I thought it was really interesting. It sort of shaped the way that I think about business now, and particularly in this space, when you're looking at buying and selling businesses, it's a good reminder to I guess make you think about the right things, to think, well, are we actually, is someone overpaying for something? Are they underpaying? Like, without understanding value, its price sort of becomes irrelevant.
Have you changed your view in any particular way about how you look at things from a broad?
I think, interestingly, I think it's probably changed the way that I look at listed companies. Obviously, with private companies, it can be a bit difficult because you don't always have the information available. But with listed companies, I think in the past I used to look at their earnings, like the profits they were making, sort of in isolation. I wasn't really looking at, well, profits are one thing, but what returns are shareholders getting on those profits, because inevitably they're the owners of the business. And also, I guess, as Leath mentioned about working capital a little earlier, it's understanding, well, to keep this business running, how much do shareholders have to actually keep tipping in to run the business? I thought that was really interesting. And also the other thing is about how are you generating those earnings? Are those earnings coming organically because you've got your business is economically viable, or are you getting those earnings because you've borrowed a ton of money and now you're just using that money to go out and get those earnings? So I guess there's different ways of looking at it, but it's sort of it's been good to help me sort of reshape the way that I think about business and how businesses perform.
And if you could have one law changed, what would it be?
That's a good one.
No lawyer's going to fess up to that.
I know. Look, without getting too political in the landscape, I would have. I think maybe perhaps a reduction to the corporate tax rate. I think it would help to attract a bit more foreign investment into the country, and it would allow us to sort of compete at a level. Countries like Singapore and Ireland and all these other countries that are attracting a lot of foreign investment. I think it would be good, just broadly I say that without being an economist or anything, but
Yeah.
I think that's probably one. I think, and look, sort of, it's been on the forefront of everyone's minds. It's perhaps one that worth exploring. Not sure if you share the same view.
I think it's a great point, and I think that what it emphasises is that we are a global market, and there is a lot of competition amongst different countries and different markets for commerce. Yeah. And the corporate tax rate is a pretty strong headline indicator of where investment funds are going to be placed. Yep. I mean, obviously the superannuation environment here has created an enormous amount of funds for investment, so maybe we've been a bit complacent in that because that's been available within the economy. Yep. But I think that we've got to think globally, and that doesn't mean having a tax rate that competes with necessarily Singapore. I mean, that's a good point, but at least being perhaps more competitive with some of the larger contemporaries would be very, very good.
Well, it comes back to the sort of the scenario we spoke about earlier with blockchain, right? If the tax is less, more people will come here.
Correct.
Like, it's pretty simple, right?
That's right.
Is there anything that you want to add before we wrap up?
No, it's been a good conversation. Excellent. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for your time and carving out a little bit of your day amongst your other interviews. Thanks for doing it.
Okay.
Cheers, guys.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you.
Hey everybody, it's Matt again. Thanks for listening. Just a couple of things before you guys clock off. You can get all Trench Talk episodes at xrm.com.au/podcast. You can also sign up for other goodies at the same site. Just plonk your email in there and you are covered.